The announcement arrived without celebration, ceremony, or warning. Behind the guarded doors of Buckingham Palace, a sealed statement confirmed that Catherine had been granted a title carrying more authority than any royal woman had held in generations. One sentence changed the balance of the monarchy. One signature placed the future of the crown in her hands, and before the palace could control the shock, every person inside those walls understood that nothing would ever be the same again. October 14th, 9:15 a.m. The air inside Kensington Palace was cold, quiet, and heavy with unspoken tension. The private secretary to the sovereign stood in the doorway, holding a thick parchment binding order bearing the sovereign's great seal. Catherine took the document, feeling the weight of the heavy paper beneath her fingertips. She broke the red wax seal and read the final paragraph twice. Her fingers tightened around the edges before she slowly lowered the page and looked toward William. The title was not an honorary label. It was not a grand gesture meant for public relations or ceremonial photo opportunities. Royal Regent and Guardian of the Crown was a binding constitutional authority. It granted her the legal right to act in the king's name whenever he could not perform his official duties. It placed her far beyond the standard duties of a royal consort. It made her directly responsible for preserving the monarchy's continuity, its stability, and its secrets. William watched the disbelief harden into quiet resolve on his wife's face. Pride rose inside him, but so did a deep, lingering fear. He told her that millions of people across the world would see this as proof of absolute trust. But people inside the palace walls would see something very different. They would see a threat. The prince understood the brutal truth. His wife had not simply been honored. She had been placed directly between the future of the monarchy and anyone willing to challenge it. King Charles had already paid the price of that extraordinary decision. According to a restricted palace record, the king's hand trembled as he took up the fountain pen to sign the appointment decree. He paused for a long moment before setting the nib to paper. He knew that once this authority was granted, it could never be withdrawn without causing a massive constitutional crisis. It would trigger a dangerous breakdown in the very rules that keep royal power stable. The monarch was not lending Catherine temporary influence. He was permanently transferring institutional trust. Then, Catherine noticed the specific clause that changed everything. Her new powers would not wait for the distant future. They would begin immediately, while Charles was still on the throne. The decree had been designed as an immediate answer to a hidden danger moving through the household offices. A second sealed page inside the file deepened the shock. It granted her the explicit right to review senior appointments and intervene whenever decisions threatened the crown's continuity. A senior courtier waited silently outside the door as she finished reading. Before the door closed, he received a direct order to summon Camilla alone. The Queen Consort had not seen the hidden second page, but the palace was already bracing for her reaction. While the world saw Catherine's elevation as a historic honor, those closest to the throne knew the truth. Her rise had created winners, casualties, and one deeply wounded figure who never expected to be displaced. Power inside a royal family is never measured only by formal titles. It lives in private loyalties, unfinished resentments, whispered promises, and the long silences between people who know too much about one another. Catherine's appointment did not simply elevate one woman. It forced Charles, William, Camilla, and Catherine to confront what each of them feared most: weakness, betrayal, irrelevance, and the horrifying possibility that the monarchy had already begun moving forward without asking for permission. Catherine felt that pressure building long before the public understood what had taken place. Years of disciplined appearances, family stability, and absolute calm during public scandals had made her one of the palace's strongest symbols of continuity. That trust mattered because the institution desperately needed someone the public could believe in during moments of profound uncertainty. Yet, this new authority meant she was no longer standing only beside the future king. She now held constitutional responsibility in her own right. William saw the sudden shift in her almost immediately. During a private conversation preserved for the palace archive, she admitted that being chosen while Charles still reigned filled her with deep unease. She feared the appointment would be read as proof that the monarch was weakening. The prince answered carefully. He told her that trust does not always replace a ruler, but sometimes protects him from the people closest to him. Camilla felt no such reassurance. She dismissed her aide, closed the double doors herself, and sat down beside a cup of tea that had already gone cold. The Queen Consort did not touch it. She understood that Catherine's rise was not simply about the future. It was about power shifting inside the present. She could already feel her own influence narrowing, room by room, corridor by corridor. Hi viewers, do you think King Charles made the right choice by giving Catherine this power over Camilla? Type yes or no in the comments below right now. King Charles carried that same heavy fear into a private meeting with his son. The monarch crossed his private study, stopped near the tall window overlooking the gardens, and avoided William's eyes. Protecting the crown, he said in a low voice, now required trusting people who might one day have to act against his own household. The monarch's voice remained steady, but the heavy silence after those words exposed the true cost of his decision. William then learned something even more disturbing. The decision had not been sudden. His father had begun considering Catherine for this role months earlier, and had deliberately kept both William and Camilla outside the final discussions. Senior advisors supported the move only after concluding that someone inside the royal circle had interfered with sensitive decisions linked to the succession. Catherine returned to the physical decree, reading through the dense legal language once more. Near the bottom margin, she noticed a short handwritten note written in dark black ink. 2 words stood completely apart from the official protocol text. Windsor Incident. She looked up and asked Charles what those words meant. The king looked at the page, slowly closed the leather folder, and refused to answer. To understand why the king placed such extraordinary power in Catherine's hands, the investigation must turn back the clock. It goes back 3 months to a single quiet night at Windsor Castle, when a private act of administrative defiance turned palace concern into irreversible legal action. Every major royal crisis has a single moment that later becomes impossible to ignore. For this story, it happened in an isolated drawing room, when a routine discussion about emergency protocols transformed into an open challenge against the line of succession. No cameras recorded what followed. No official public minutes were released. Yet one single sentence spoken across a polished mahogany table convinced Charles that the crown was facing an active danger from inside its own walls. 3 months earlier, Charles had gathered William, Catherine, Camilla, and 3 senior advisors to establish an emergency protocol. The arrangement was meant to prevent confusion at the heart of the monarchy if the king became unable to carry out his duties. It placed William in primary control, while Catherine would manage selected household matters and protect public confidence during any transition. The line of succession is the legal framework deciding who inherits the throne. Any unauthorized attempt to tamper with that structure carries massive consequences. As the advisors passed out the formal draft papers, Camilla broke the careful calm. She openly objected to Catherine holding authority independent of the Queen Consort's office. With a measured motion, she pushed a revised document across the table. Every instruction involving household authority, she insisted, should pass through her office first before reaching the princess. The change looked minor on the surface. It appeared to be a simple administrative update, but its real structural effect was brutal. It placed the future queen beneath the current Queen Consort's private office. It gave one household the power to delay, audit, or completely block Catherine's decisions during a national crisis. Catherine read the altered page without saying a word. William leaned forward, pulled the paper toward himself, and scanned the new chain of command. He saw immediately that his wife's name had been removed from its original position and placed lower on the institutional chart. He looked directly across the table and asked who had authorized the change. The prince's voice remained cold and controlled, but the direct question landed like a formal accusation in the quiet room. Camilla defended herself at once. Her voice rose slightly as she claimed she was only protecting the king from an inexperienced parallel court that could divide the palace during an emergency. Catherine felt the sharp humiliation of the moment, but she refused to respond in anger. She folded her hands in her lap, looked toward Charles, and waited to see if his silence would become approval. Charles felt the room closing in around him. Challenging his wife would expose a deep, private fracture he had spent years trying to conceal from the press. Yet defending her actions would tell William and Catherine that personal influence mattered more than the legal future of the crown. The tension reached a breaking point when a senior advisor consulted a restricted file and made a shocking revelation. The altered paper had not been drafted during the meeting. It had been prepared days earlier and covertly circulated to two senior household officials without the king's knowledge or consent. The room went completely silent. Charles ended the meeting on the spot. He took both versions of the document, ordered every copy secured in a private safe, and instructed constitutional lawyers to draft a new authority that no palace office could ever override. Weeks later, Camilla learned that the entire incident had been recorded in a confidential memorandum. She became convinced that Catherine had helped build the case against her. That buried memorandum transformed a private family dispute into hard evidence. And when Camilla finally demanded to stand face to face with Catherine, years of restrained tension broke through the palace walls, setting off a confrontation that would permanently alter the British monarchy forever. The Windsor Castle meeting had ended in absolute silence, but the paper trail it created was already spreading like poison through the veins of the royal administration. King Charles had locked the two conflicting documents inside his private desk, believing he had contained the damage. He was wrong. Paperwork in a palace never truly stays hidden. It moves quietly in black leather dispatch boxes, passes through the hands of unsworn junior aides, and leaves invisible footprints in routine administrative logs. By the following week, the subtle shift in power was already becoming visible across official schedules. Emergency communications, once routed directly through the king's main office, were suddenly being flagged for secondary review. Staff members loyal to the Queen Consort began questioning routine directives issued by the Prince and Princess of Wales. A quiet, methodical campaign was underway to test how much influence Catherine really possessed before her new title could be finalized. The first clear sign of this friction surfaced on a rainy Tuesday morning at 10:15 a.m. inside the private secretary's office at Kensington Palace. A routine scheduling document regarding the management of royal estates during a health emergency was returned with a handwritten correction in the margin. The note suggested that all future security briefings involving the succession should be copied to Queen Camilla's private staff before being shown to Prince William. The change was framed as a simple administrative update designed to improve communication. But to anyone who knew how palace governance worked, it was a subtle attempt to build a permanent checkpoint around the future monarch. William's private secretary noticed the change immediately. He did not raise his voice. He did not write an angry email. Instead, he placed the flagged document inside a red folder and brought it directly to the prince. William studied the marginal note in silence. The handwriting was unmistakable. It did not belong to a clerk or an overzealous courtier. It came directly from the Queen Consort's private household. Catherine joined William in his study minutes later. She picked up the page and read the brief inscription. She did not express shock. She did not display anger. Years of operating within the rigid boundaries of the royal institution had taught her that raw emotion was a liability in moments like this. Instead, she saw the note for what it truly was, a deliberate test of resolve. The Queen Consort's office was attempting to normalize administrative oversight over the Wales household before the king's health forced any official transition. What Camilla had not realized was that every move she made was being recorded. Unknown to her staff, the sovereign's private office had already initiated an internal audit of all administrative communications issued since the Windsor Castle gathering. The audit was not conducted through noisy inquiries or dramatic confrontations. It was carried out quietly by senior archivists reviewing digital delivery logs, physical signature books, and internal mail registries. The findings were troubling. Within a 3-week window, no fewer than 4 distinct operational directives had been subtly altered before reaching their final destinations. In each instance, Catherine's authority over emergency household planning had been watered down or repositioned beneath the Queen Consort's jurisdiction. The alterations were carefully written to look like routine clerical adjustments. Taken individually, each change was entirely deniable, but when mapped out on a single timeline, they revealed a clear and coordinated pattern of institutional isolation. Catherine was not merely a passive subject in this investigation. She understood that surviving inside this environment required total awareness of the paper trail. She requested a full copy of the internal communication logs for her own legal advisors. As she analyzed the entries, an alarming detail emerged. The revised chain of command document that Camilla had pushed across the table at Windsor had not originated from the official governance committee. It had been drafted on a private terminal inside the Queen Consort's quarters 4 days prior to the meeting. This was the critical turning point. It proved beyond doubt that the attempt to subordinate Catherine was not an impulsive reaction to a heated discussion. It was a premeditated administrative strike designed to lock down power before the king's health could deteriorate further. The discovery transformed what had been framed as a personal misunderstanding into a documented violation of palace protocol. When Camilla discovered that an audit was actively tracking her household's paperwork, her composure began to break. She realized that the very mechanism she had used to assert control, the administrative paper trail, was now being compiled into a formal case against her. The buried memorandum from the Windsor meeting was no longer just a private memory. It had become an active record in a restricted archive file. Desperate to halt the momentum building against her, Camilla made a decision that broke every established rule of palace diplomacy. She bypassed the private secretaries, ignored the formal scheduling protocol, and walked directly to Catherine's private residence at Kensington Palace. She demanded an immediate face-to-face meeting, insisting that no advisors, assistants, or security officers remain in the room. The atmosphere inside the drawing room at Kensington Palace was suffocatingly quiet when the double doors closed. The two highest-ranking women in the British Monarchy stood just feet apart, stripped of their public smiles, ceremonial jewelry, and protective staff. Camilla did not sit down. She stood near the center of the room, holding a printed copy of the newly signed decree granting Catherine her elevated regency powers. Her voice was low, taut, and sharp, as she demanded to know whether Catherine had personally orchestrated the audit that was now dismantling her household's influence. She accused the princess of using public popularity as a weapon to undermine those who had spent decades serving the monarch. Catherine remained seated, her hands folded calmly in her lap, looking directly into the Queen Consort's eyes. She did not raise her voice. She did not offer a defensive explanation. She knew that in a confrontation like this, the person who loses control of their temper loses control of the narrative. She stated plainly that she had not requested the audit, nor had she sought the title. However, she made it equally clear that she would not step aside while the constitutional stability of the line of succession was systematically undermined from within. Camilla's restraint shattered completely. She declared that Catherine was creating a dangerous rival court that would divide the royal family during its most fragile hour. She insisted that her own actions at Windsor were driven entirely by a desire to protect Charles from being isolated by his own heir. She argued that a Queen Consort had a fundamental right to oversee any decision that affected her husband's household. It was at that exact second that Catherine delivered the decisive revelation. She picked up a folder from the table beside her and opened it. Inside was the original draft from the Windsor meeting, complete with the timestamp showing it had been prepared on Camilla's private terminal days before the succession discussion even took place. Camilla froze. The color drained from her face as she looked down at the physical proof of her secret action. The argument that she had acted on impulse to protect the king collapsed under the weight of the dated record. The paper proved advanced planning, unauthorized circulation, and a direct attempt to deceive the sovereign. Catherine looked up at the Queen Consort and delivered a short, quiet line that brought the entire argument to an absolute standstill. She reminded Camilla that if a formal written document signed by the king could be altered in secret today, then no title, promise, or position held by anyone in the household would be worth anything tomorrow. The silence that followed was total. Camilla looked at the princess, realized that her leverage was entirely gone, and turned toward the door without saying another word. She left the appointment decree sitting on the table between them, untouched and undisputed. Word arrived at Kensington Palace less than 30 minutes later that King Charles had summoned a restricted emergency council at Windsor Castle. The confrontation between the two women had reached its limit, and the formal institutional machinery was now taking over to deliver the final, binding resolution. The doors of the restricted council chamber at Windsor Castle closed with a heavy, final sound at 3 p.m. Inside, the air was cold, thick with tension, and marked by an unmistakable sense of institutional crisis. King Charles sat at the head of the long table, looking exhausted. He removed his glasses, pressed his hand over his face, and admitted to the small room that the monarchy could not survive another crisis where personal loyalties overruled written duty. Around him sat Prince William, two senior constitutional advisors, the keeper of the Privy Seal, and a senior courtier representing the royal household. The presence of the keeper of the Privy Seal was the ultimate tell. He guarded the official seal used to approve the most consequential decisions of the state, proving this meeting was not for empty discussion. This was about creating binding, enforceable power. William spoke first, his voice sharp and steady. He told his father that leaving Catherine's new title vague or symbolic would leave her completely exposed. It would invite constant attacks from anyone inside the palace who resented her rise. Vague power would allow competing household offices to issue conflicting orders during an emergency. That kind of internal confusion would shatter public confidence and place the line of succession under severe strain at the exact moment the crown required absolute clarity. Charles understood the legal reality, but the emotional cost tormented him. Strengthening Catherine's authority to this level would publicly humiliate Camilla. It would expose his marriage as a battleground divided by power. The sovereign was being forced to make a brutal choice: protect the woman beside him, or protect the institution he had sworn an oath to preserve. Neither option offered any mercy. Then a senior constitutional advisor opened a dark leather file and laid out the final piece of evidence. According to the documented council record, 2 senior officials inside the Queen Consort's household had already begun implementing Camilla's altered Windsor instructions. They were acting on them before learning that Charles had never authorized the changes. The revelation changed the temperature of the room instantly. What had been framed as a private, internal disagreement had crossed the line into active administrative rebellion. It was already affecting real palace operations. The council moved with terrifying swiftness after that. They formally approved a confidential governance protocol. This fixed set of rules granted Catherine the absolute authority to suspend any household directive that threatened the succession, emergency communications, or the monarch's recorded wishes. It placed her constitutional power directly above any competing influence inside the palace. Charles took up the fountain pen, but his hand hovered over the paper. He stared at the final line, knowing full well that Camilla would understand the message the second she saw it. Then he lowered the nib and signed his name directly beneath Catherine's full new title. William did not smile. He knew the signature protected his wife, but it also created its first official casualty. Before the meeting adjourned, an order was signed removing a key palace official from the Queen Consort's chain of command. Catherine executed her first formal act within hours. She temporarily suspended the official who had circulated the altered Windsor paper, pending a full internal review. That review was essential because the palace could not protect the line of succession while allowing covert instructions to pass through official channels unchecked. From that exact moment, every emergency protocol, every decision involving the Wales household, and every strategic plan for the future crown had to pass directly through Catherine's desk. During a documented interview with the suspended official, Catherine uncovered a chilling detail. The official admitted he had acted only after receiving a handwritten note marked with Camilla's personal cipher. That cipher was the private symbol used to confirm an instruction came directly from the Queen Consort. The paper was absolute proof. It was enough evidence to destroy Camilla's remaining influence permanently and remove her from public life. Late that evening, Catherine met William alone inside their private quarters at Kensington Palace. She laid the ciphered note on the table between them. William read the message in complete silence. He looked up at his wife and asked what she intended to do with it. The prince warned her that showing mercy could be mistaken for weakness, inviting another challenge down the road. He reminded her that unused power can easily become a trap. But Catherine refused to let personal anger dictate how she governed. She admitted the humiliation at Windsor had cut deeply, but the title had been created to protect the crown from private retaliation. That protection had to include restraint against her own worst impulses. Catherine offered a quiet settlement. Camilla would surrender all operational authority over succession planning and emergency governance, but she would keep her ceremonial role, her charities, and her public standing beside the king. William looked at his wife, finally understanding the true depth of her strength. She was defining what her authority would mean. True power in her hands would be measured by what she refused to destroy. The prince picked up the handwritten note and walked over to the fireplace. Catherine gave a single, quiet nod, and the original paper was consumed by the flames. By sunrise the next morning, the palace could no longer contain the story. News of Catherine's elevated title broke across national news networks, newspapers, and phones throughout Britain. Catherine's portrait dominated the front pages, beneath bold headlines calling her the Crown's emergency guardian. Broadcasters explained that her authority now extended far beyond the normal duties of a royal princess, placing her at the absolute center of decisions involving public confidence and institutional stability. Outside Buckingham Palace, massive crowds began to assemble along the perimeter railings. People carried bouquets of flowers, handmade posters, and small paper crowns. The camera captured a single, unforgettable image near the center of the crowd. A young girl stood holding a paper crown high above her head, while an elderly woman beside her quietly wiped tears from her eyes, whispering that the monarchy finally looked prepared for tomorrow. Catherine watched the live television coverage from her window at Kensington Palace, feeling no sense of personal triumph. She turned to William and remarked that the public was celebrating a grand title without ever seeing the deep pain that had produced it. Every cheer outside the gates stood right beside an unhealed wound inside the family. Inside her private quarters, Camilla faced the same television screen in total isolation. A panel of commentators described Catherine as the monarchy's new center of gravity. The Queen Consort reached for the remote and switched off the display. Later that afternoon, she asked Charles whether the public had already chosen its future without her. The king answered softly that the crown survives by recognizing where true trust lies before it is too late. Then he revealed that Catherine had intentionally protected Camilla's public dignity despite possessing the written evidence to destroy it. That act of mercy broke the Queen Consort's remaining resistance. Camilla accepted the terms of the settlement, and through a brief recorded palace statement, she pledged her full support to the new Royal Regent and Guardian of the Crown. The final meeting took place 3 days later at Windsor Castle, inside the very drawing room where the conflict had begun. Charles gathered Catherine, William, and Camilla around the polished table. On the mahogany surface lay 2 documents. The first was the binding decree confirming Catherine's constitutional authority over succession safeguards and emergency governance. The second was the altered draft from 3 months earlier. King Charles looked at his wife, then at his son and daughter-in-law. Without saying a single word, he picked up the altered Windsor paper and tore it clean in half. No private household, the king declared, would ever again be permitted to override the recorded wishes of the crown. Camilla did not offer a defense. According to the documented record, she admitted that her fear of becoming irrelevant had pushed her across a dangerous line. She gave her solemn word never again to interfere with the legal line of succession. Catherine responded without a hint of triumph. She assured Camilla that her dignity and public standing would remain fully protected, The two women did not embrace, nor did they pretend the emotional damage had vanished. But when they exchanged a slow, restrained nod across the table, the war that had threatened to tear the royal household apart finally came to an end. Catherine stepped out of Windsor Castle into the cool evening air. Her authority was absolute, her restraint was unbroken, and the future of the crown was secured. She had proven that true strength does not belong to the loudest voice in the palace, but to the person strong enough to protect the crown without losing herself. If this deep dive into palace intrigue gave you a new perspective on the modern monarchy, please hit the like button and share this video with fellow royal followers. Don't forget to subscribe and click the notification bell so you never miss an insider narrative break. Leave a comment down below with your thoughts. Did Catherine make the right choice by sparing Camilla, or should she have used the evidence to remove her entirely? The internal battle over Catherine's title may be settled, but a far more dangerous conspiracy was already taking shape in the shadowed corridors of Highgrove House. Just 48 hours after the Windsor Agreement was signed, a confidential dispatch box vanished from the sovereign's private study. Inside was a single red folder marked with 3 words that could dismantle the entire settlement: the Kensington Ledger. In our next investigation, we expose the secret recording that proves someone inside the inner circle was feeding classified succession details to an overseas legal team before the king even signed the decree. You cannot afford to miss a single second of what comes next. Subscribe now, because the real exposure has only just begun.